You're listening to Politics Unspun with me, Jack McCluskey.
And me, Charlie Carter.
We're two economists discussing the hottest political debates.
Like, do tax cuts really boost economic growth?
How high should the minimum wage be?
Is Scotland ready for independence?
Should post-work pints be free?
Yes. And because there's nothing we love more than the sound of our own voices, we're putting our future career prospects on the line to share our thoughts on each one of these deliciously controversial topics.
We hope you enjoy. This podcast follows the new Labour government's first budget, but as always, we should start with a little chat to showcase our interpersonal skills. So, Charlie, you have a girlfriend who loves you, right?
Jesus Christ, where is this going?
A yes will suffice, Charlie.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's the weekend, so spend much time with her today?
No, I skedaddled to a pub with you, and we have spent the last 6 hours chatting shit. So, and now I'm here recording this. So no, I have not spent much time with my beloved.
Yeah, so while the rest of our beloved listeners sat, I don't know, watching TV, having a fun time, going out, doing stuff, we were researching all the intricacies and technicalities of the budget, which was
Yeah, and now we're sat here on a Saturday evening when all our friends are out for Halloween.
But once we've waded through all the technical info, it did get quite interesting.
It's like the Doomsday Book, man. I mean, it could have been they could have made it a bit shorter, but they're not thinking about us when they wrote this, for God's sake.
I know, man. I must say, I do need to mention how the budget was delivered. And I did find that it was a little bit all over the place. I mean, I watched it live and I had to pause a bunch of times because they're throwing so many numbers at you. But in terms of the actual structure, they threw in the big topic bits in amongst lots of little niche, tiny things. And it was like, why? Hit us with the big stuff now.
So
and then you can do your little subtle stuff at the end.
I don't hate myself enough to have sat through it, Jack. So I've just heard what it was like. I just watched the highlights and heard what everyone else has been talking about it, and obviously read it afterwards. And I mean, we can't say that it wasn't a huge budget, but it's insane, right?
No, it was a big one. Obviously, we've sat down and tried to look at all the line-by-line items of it, and I think we've come to a sort of idea of how to.
While we weren't ruining people's Saturdays, screaming at each other in a.
These poor people just there trying to have a nice time, chatting to each other, having a pint, and we are being so loud
talking about their holidays,
about national insurance.
Yeah, we were just shouting about employer contributions. And I was like, after this screaming match, when it felt like, I had a few beers, so I went to the toilet. I came back and I realized exactly how quiet that place was when we weren't shouting.
Did it stop us? No,
absolutely.
But anyway, so starting, I think it's important to start with the context.
Basically, we're all fucked. It's all no. So basically, the UK has obviously not been no question that the UK has been struggling economically, as have other main comparable OECD countries been struggling since 2008. I mean, the UK has flatlined in recent years. In a GDP per capita basis, we remain lower than pre-pandemic levels, and we've constantly have very slow productivity growth. And this is known colloquially as what is called the UK productivity puzzle. The UK consistently lags behind comparable countries in terms of its level of productivity. And the reason this is important is because productivity essentially defines how wealthy we are as a country. It allows us to pay for our public services. It determines our tax revenues. It determines our wages, our standards of living. And therefore, productivity is incredibly important. And the UK doesn't generate a whole lot of stuff compared to France, Germany, Scandinavia, and other countries per person. And so the economics behind this has been really, really important. And obviously, this has all come in the context of 14 years of the Tories. And we've seen very low levels of investment in public services, given their sort of more right-wing approach to economics. They believe in smaller governments, lower taxes to essentially keep the burden off of business. But what we've seen that's come in tandem with is record low levels of public investment. And we've had this new budget and we've just completely turned the tide on that.
Oh, we really have. It's a very Labour budget, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and I think the left are very happy with this budget. This is a much more Tony Blair, Gordon Brown sort of budget. And yeah, Labour's back after 14 years of the Tories of very different approach.
Because there was concern running up to the election that, I don't know, the Labour and Tory were somewhat indistinguishable, but that's definitely not true now. I mean, it's clear that they're playing we'll tax more to spend more and take more debt to invest more.
Absolutely. And I mean, this does lead to the natural question of they didn't tell anyone about this.
Is anyone shocked, though? I mean,
No, but I am also, as a left-leaning man myself, I am happy with the budget broadly. But it would have been nice if Keir Starmer had forgone a couple of extra seats in the general election just to not lie to people. And I think there is an element of this that is incredibly frustrating, whether you believe in the budget or not. It is obvious what they've been doing, and it's been obvious for the last year what they were doing. And it's just almost frustrating, a little bit disappointing that it has panned out this way to a degree, politically at least.
Yeah. So I guess those lies that you're alluding to is twofold, right? So we've got the idea of this.
Well, they said they weren't going to increase taxes and they weren't going to borrow. And I don't know what everyone else thinks. I don't know if I'm going clinically insane, but all they've done is increase tax and increase borrowing, which I'm personally fine with. But
yeah,
they did lie. we can't get around that. They absolutely did lie, and I don't think they should. I don't think they should be let off the hook for that, even if it's a good budget. They still did lie. Yeah,
and I think we'll come back to this, but I think we've edged our audience enough, and we should probably give a little bit of an overview.
What a word choice!
Well, if anyone's like me at home about economics, so there we are. So
stop.
I'm going to cut that out.
Cut that out.
Okay, so I'm just going to give a sort of an overview of the budget. Clearly, we'll break it down a little bit more later, but for people who just want to hear what happened and then switch off, here's your bit. Okay, so the main thing is that Rachel Reeves said that we need to raise £40 billion of tax. Okay, and that is to cover both 22 billion black hole, we'll expand on that later, but also because they're concerned about the public services which are crumbling around us. But let's just give a quick breakdown of where these taxes are come from. The main one is national insurance contributions. Yes, the thing that you thought they weren't going to tax, but no, they did it on the employer, not the employee. So that's how they sort of feel like they've got round their own self-imposed rules. So that's expected to raise around half of that tax. So that's going up from 13.8% up to 15%. But the big bit, the bit that everyone in the room went audibly like was when they said that they're reducing the threshold, which is when the employer would start paying these taxes, from £9,000 to £5,000 for each employee. So now they're paying national insurance contributions for anyone who's earning more than £5,000 in their employment, that's a big change, and that's really where most of the money is coming from for the national insurance contributions. So that's, as I say, half of the tax being raised through that way.
Isn't the second biggest just fraud? We need to stop fraud.
Oh God, yeah,
I love it.
Look, when I was listening to it live,
love this one.
They kept more and more things were just coming up. It's like, so we're going to close a loophole, we're going to chase fraud here, we're going to get people to pay their taxes earlier.
Dave didn't pay his parking ticket last year, so we're going to come after him and his family.
And the list just continued, net of having to hire all these new staff to detect all this fraud and stuff like that. They're talking about it raising nearly like 5 out of that 40 billion is possibly going to come from fraud prevention and stuff like that, which is
so basically they're trying to spend government money more efficiently. That's the argument, right?
Yeah, and raise it more efficiently as well.
Yes, yeah, and that's by introducing new technologies, hiring more workers to be able to detect fraud, closing tax loopholes, all of these things. And it seems like this is a play out of the right-wing playbook to a degree, because the answer that the right wing always have to how you're going to cut government spending is, we're just going to cut inefficiency. So it's a really easy political play that often doesn't really yield many actual outcomes, but is a really easy thing to say politically. But their number is really high and also a bit dubious.
Yeah. When it forms that big a proportion of the tax you're expecting to raise is through these sort of things, I do get a little bit worried. Bearing in mind that the IFS have said that they're only just about reaching their spending rules, only by like 10 million, which in the context of a whole budget is tiny. Yeah, so if any of these fraud prevention things or whatever don't reach the highs that they've expected, which, as I've said, are fairly big, when we're talking about nearly an eighth of the budget, then they're going to go over and they'll have to borrow. And so I think that's that part. So that's the second biggest, is through that. But the next bits, I'm going to go rattle through these fairly quickly, but some of them we'll have mentioned before in different podcasts, but they've scraped together from all different angles. They got it from scrapping non-dom. Remember us saying do that? That's about 2 billion. Then you've got the changes to capital gains tax. So they've raised both the lower rate and the higher rate. So the lower rate's going from 10% to 18%. That's a big change. And then the higher rate's going from 20 to 24%. Remember, most people don't pay capital gains tax. next with the private school. So obviously this was a
Yeah.
big politically contentious thing running up to the election, was talking about making private schools pay VAT and business rates.
Because they're treated as sort of charitable status, right? Exempt from VAT and business rates.
Yes,
But not anymore.
Not
baby.
anymore. Yeah, exactly. And I didn't realise how much they're expecting to raise from this, but it's about 1.5 billion.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, these numbers I'm throwing out here, it's very difficult to pin down the numbers from places. So I'm giving a general sort of idea of the range that they're in. So don't quote me exactly, but it's about 1.5 billion.
It's all a bit of Chinese whispers. I'm pretty sure these were generated from a random number generator anyway. So we're not holding you too much to account.
Obviously, cutting the winter fuel payments, I guess that counts as spending rather than taxing. But in terms of raising money, that's also raising a significant amount. Remember, that was quite contentious. We're talking another about 1.5 billion. And then smaller things, inheritance tax changes. They've basically frozen the threshold when you start paying inheritance tax, and that's raising close to 1 billion, although that does increase over time. They're expecting by the end of the decade, it's going to be about 2.3 billion. And then nice little one to show that our earlier podcasts were relevant and important. Sin taxes, so things on like tobacco, alcohol, and they've added a new thing for vaping. Those are going to raise, it's going to be a small amount, like it's less than 500 million.
It's a small amount, but the motivation is, like we said in that previous episode, that it's essentially to take the pressure off the NHS. And we're hoping to reduce costs on the NHS by reducing the amount of people smoking, reduce the amount of people drinking. And the idea is that that's going to boost productivity of people working and also reduce the pressure on the NHS. So there could be indirect cost savings from that as well, even though it's not directly raising a huge amount.
Yeah, exactly. And in that way, we're based on our episode, we think it's probably a little bit too small, the amount that they're expecting to raise from these taxes.
Yeah, we can.
Those taxes
we'll go into our critiques and comments on the budget afterwards, I think. But yeah, no, exactly. I mean, but I think that's a really good rundown. So you've done the boring stuff, the stuff we're all cutting. I'm going to talk about the things we're spending, baby. We can really think of us as like a spend and invest budget. Obviously, they've relaxed the fiscal rules. Now what happens is that the government doesn't want to be in a budget deficit by the end of the decade in what we call day-to-day spending. So that is just spending that is day-to-day to keep these public services running. And now what's happening is that the capital investment is being exempt from these budget rules. The idea being that if we're investing as a government, that essentially should proliferate growth, which then essentially allows it to pay for itself. And it's trying to get away from this almost technocratic, bureaucratic, static way of thinking just to save every penny. And the idea is to free up a little bit more public funds for investment. So capital investment as a whole will increase by 13 billion next year, taking that will take total departmental capital spending to 131 billion by 2025 to 2026. And I think total spending as a proportion of GDP is going to increase from about 40% to about 45%. So total spending is increasing, bringing us a little bit more in line with mainland Europe, which historically we've lagged behind. We've often preferred a much smaller state. This is bringing us much higher. So I'll just get into the numbers, try to get through it real quick. There's a massive increase in infrastructure spending, nearly a 50% increase in funding for local roads and maintenance. And they're actually increasing up to 1.6 billion to maintain and renew the nation's roads, increasing from 500 million on last year. There's also record levels of research and development, with 20 billion being allocated to that. And I think this is a really important aspect for growth, really investing money into the economy, investing in money into productivity growth. That's going to be huge. There's a huge amount of private investment and proliferation of private investment going into carbon capture, infrastructure, and energy projects like Sizewell and Great British Energy. There's been a huge increase in funding for the NHS and education. So in terms of education, there's a lot more investing in schools. 1.4 billion increase for school rebuilding, which is in a 500 million pound increase. And there's also been a huge increase in funding as part of the industrial strategy. We're also seeing much more investment into projects like HS2, which is now going to Euston, Jack, which is amazing. So they're obviously listening to our advice. And there's also a huge amount more funding for capital in the NHS, about 1 billion more for the NHS in additional capital. And that's basically to address the crumbling infrastructure, maintenance, repairs, and upgrades of the estate. And then there's a huge amount of spending going into general NHS resources. So these things, basically, there's just a huge amount more investment going into capital and projects. And that the idea is that this is a very pro-growth budget for that reason. trying to encourage growth and sort of almost act as a catalyst to increase productivity over the long run, which we're going to talk about soon, but is a big problem in the UK economy.
Absolutely. And I think one of those bits that you pointed out there, the change in debt rules or fiscal rules, for me is the best part of the budget. I don't know what you think.
Well, I mean, I absolutely agree that targeted government investment is the best way to get ourselves out of the productivity hole. I mean, the UK has often been described, especially through the late 20th century, as the sick man of Europe. And we're also the part of Europe that often invests the least in public services. And I mean, there is a correlation, if not necessarily causation, but there is an issue there where we do have this cultural problem where we want incredibly low tax, but also world-class public services. And I hate to break it to anyone who's listening who doesn't agree with that, but it's just not the case. And unfortunately, we live in a world in which, firms can't operate just on a basis of low tax. People can't operate on the basis of low tax. We need publicly funded schools. We need well-educated people. We need low crime. We need healthcare services, because no matter how low taxes, if you're dealing with all of those health and education and crime issues, you're never going to have a functioning society. Unfortunately, we do have those issues, and lower taxes isn't the route to fixing that. And I think that's pretty clear to see currently. And anyone without a Liz Truss brain should be able to sort of get their head around that. I think it's a very pragmatic approach. And I mean, just to give you a size of numbers as well. So the NHS resource spending has increased by 22 billion. Education increase has increased by 11 billion. Crime and justice has increased by 1.9 billion. They're increasing on defence and intelligence by 3 billion. And they're giving core spending to local governments about 1.3 billion as well. So these are huge investments into improving infrastructure, improving these critical foundations of our economy, which will help the free market operate better in the long run. So I'm broadly positive about the whole thing.
Yeah. And a big emphasis in investment in capital, using borrowing, which is, we agree, is okay, because
Absolutely,
if you're investing in assets and things that are going to generate a return, investment should be calculated or valued differently to just debt for
and to draw symmetries with the US currently, Kamala Harris was talking to Mark Cuban, obviously Mark Cuban being the billionaire investor who's endorsed Kamala Harris, and he was saying, what approach do you take to government spending? Essentially, what's your philosophy behind it? And she said, very much, as in a very politicized way, obviously, it's not about how much you spend, it's about the return on the investment. And I mean, that's just anything. That's how businesses run. And for some reason, those on the right in particular often have a very pragmatic approach to business, in that when you spend something, it needs a return, but maybe not necessarily with government. And I think as long as government money is being spent efficiently, which obviously a huge emphasis is being put on here, then it's a necessity. And I think 14 years of leadership has shown that,
Yeah. I mean, Krugman, so this is, again, I've mentioned him all the time, but he's an economist that we both like. He is left-leaning, so you've got to be aware of that.
He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, though, isn't he? So he's not
exactly.
He's not just any guy on the street like us.
No. Yeah, but he was pointing out that during the time of austerity in the UK, so this is the Tory government sort of 2010 onwards, were trying to reduce our national debt. And given the debt rules that they had that we've now changed, that would also mean sort of a constraint on investment, public investment. And what Krugman had been saying was that's so silly in a time when private investment hasn't rebounded, and it's been anemic since then, really. And we had all-time low interest rates, so the cost of borrowing for the government was low. This should be the time that we unleash public investment, but we weren't, because of the fiscal rules we had, which treated debt from, to pay for just giving money away as taxes as the same as raising debt to pay for these sort of investments. So I think it's a needed change, definitely.
Yeah. So I've been working as an economist for the Institute of Policy Research, and a lot of the work I've been doing is on how productivity and innovation correlate and interact. And what we see a lot from the data currently is not that firms aren't innovating because regulation is too high or tax is too high, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of what the data we see is that the demand isn't high enough, consumers aren't confident enough, and they don't have a skilled enough workforce to be able to innovate sustainably. And when they do innovate, they're not seeing the return on investment because of weak consumer demand and other factors. And I think broadly, that's a symptom of post-2008, where government didn't react quick enough to these issues. Luckily, I think we're seeing it now, that these larger investments into the public services is a necessity. And I think if people sort of see this as it's a subscription in a country that works, people can feel a lot more palatable about it. I mean, I am more than happy to pay more tax if that means that I can get a GP appointment. If I know that I don't have to send my kid to private school for them to get a good education, that I can get to work on time, that I can, those are way more important to me than having low taxes. And that's as a person on a relatively low income. So I do think this is important. And I think this points to a correction of issues that we've had for quite a long time in the UK.
I agree. So where would you like to go from here?
I think we can jump right into national insurance. Yeah.
Oh, right. So again, one of the reasons we said that it seemed a little bit like the government lied about not raising taxes on working people is that they've raised the tax on national insurance.
That they've raised the tax on working people.
Yeah, exactly. So what are your general thoughts on this, Charlie?
I disagree with this relatively strongly. And this was, for listeners, the thing we were sort of disagreeing about. My main problem with employer contributions for national insurance is that I think it's just better replaced by an income tax. I think this budget has obviously worked so hard to not raise tax on income that it's almost constructed policies that are worse on aggregate, or at least very similar on aggregate. And I think we just disagree on how different it is. My main argument is that if you increase employer contributions, I just think that's relatively undesirable. Higher employer contributions in a normal labor economics job search framework. What this essentially does is reduce the value of an employer-worker match. And if we're assuming that not under normal labor search rules, under what we call Nash bargaining, this essentially will reduce wages in the long run, in equilibrium. And this is going to be especially pronounced in the UK, where we have very strong monopsony. So where workers don't have a lot of worker power and bargaining power. So basically what I'm saying is that employer contributions, increasing them, only serve to reduce wages in equilibrium anyway. And actually employee contributions would have the opposite effect. So the reason the Conservative reduction in national insurance was bad is the exact same reason that this is bad, in my estimation. I mean, it would be better to raise national insurance back to its old levels, or symmetrically almost just increase income tax. That's my main argument. And the problem I have with this is that you have higher employer contributions, that suppresses wages, which then makes hiring workers desirable over investment in capital, which is the fundamental problem the UK has anyway, that firms refuse to invest in capital because labour is so essentially undervalued and cheap compared to what they're producing. And that's my whole sort of cycle of this problem. I just think it's a policy that reinforces this problem of low wages and substituting with labour over capital. And that's just a productivity problem, and it's Pareto inoptimal for everyone.
So you're saying that raising national insurance contributions of employers is worse than raising it from employees, and it's worse than raising just it from income taxes generally. And on top of that, that it depresses wages in a way that means that we're still choosing low-cost labour rather than capital deepening, so investment in, machineries and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Much better explained. I mean, that's my fundamental argument. And I mean, the IFS, Paul Johnson, a lot of high-profile economists have come out and said that instead of increasing this tax, which I think is ridiculous personally, you're better off increasing income tax. But obviously they couldn't do that because they've created this idea they're not going to increase tax on quote unquote working people. I mean, even though they have. I mean, this is what this is. So don't make no mistake, increasing employer contributions is a tax on working people. Better economically to raise income tax, personally.
I think so. I mean, I think the idea of national insurance anyway, given that it doesn't fulfill what it originally was planned to do, which is only be spent on like healthcare and pensions and stuff like that. Now it just goes in the same pot as income tax. So really its whole role is to pretend to the population that their taxes are lower than they actually are.
Exactly.
I mean, it's just a political way of taxing people more. And from that angle, I know we slightly disagree on this. I believe that raising 10 billion from national insurance from either the employer or the employee has the same sort of effect in the long run. In the short run, I think because of wages stay sort of sticky in the short term, it would be mostly paid by the employer, so it's mostly affecting them. But in the long term, because of how the tax gets passed through to employees, in the classic, simple, nice, neat models we have, I know you have more complex ones to do with search theory, but in the classic neat ones, whether you do it through an employee or an employer, national insurance, it should be similar because it gets passed through based on the sort of power of the employer to dictate wages.
In the long run.
In the long run.
And in the long run, we're all dead, as the famous Keynes said.
Yeah,
No.
but the point being that they've raised this tax, and I think there's no one on the left getting annoyed about it as much as if you had raised it on the employee. Everyone would have been freaked out, but really they're quite similar.
But just to clarify, I mean, you don't think there's a much of a difference. I think there's a negative difference.
Yeah.
Like, I think employer contributions is worse than employee contributions, where you think they're the same. Either way, they've lied. You know, we don't disagree on that. It's these. Yeah.
Either way, they've lied, and we both agree it would be better to do it through an income tax.
Exactly.
So it's sort of
we're
just
differing
us
on
being,
the extent to which we disagree. I mean,
it's us
Yeah.
being economists and arguing over niche things that in the end we agree about the major thing, which is
Yeah.
it should have been done on the basic rate of income tax, right?
yeah,
And also lowering the threshold to £5,000 means that this tax is going to be borne on lower productivity workers as well. So it's
yeah.
less progressive than the way it was originally. So it is a concern. And if you combine it with the minimum wage, which has just been increased, which we agreed with, but you've got that at the same time as employers having to pay higher contributions for people who are low paid. So the combination is...
This goes back to my argument, right? That by having these employer contributions, you're essentially reducing the value of employing a worker. So therefore firms post less vacancies, wages are lower, whatever. And in tandem with that policy, you've now got an increase in the minimum wage. So you do counteract that effect of lower wages on the low set wage labour market a little bit. So they've obviously recognised that as a problem, either inadvertently, subconsciously, or they've actually acknowledged it as a problem. But I do think that the last thing the UK should be doing now is having policy that reinforces low wages, which I do think the employer contributions do relatively adamantly. And I think it's a hidden tax. And I think you're better off increasing income tax, which sort of has the opposite effect on equilibrium before tax wages. So income tax would have been predominant, I think. Much, much, much better policy.
And are we both agreed, you can disagree if you like, that it's okay that it's being levied on sort of the average worker?
Yeah. I'm not playing the whole left-wing game of dodging this and going, it has to be on high-income people, because unfortunately it doesn't have to. Yeah, a 2p increase on everyone, basically, keeping the minimum threshold the same would be ideal.
Yeah, because... And I think it's fair if you phrased it to people that, look, you pay more tax because the cost of your healthcare and the things that you use on a daily basis or will have to use in your life has increased. I think that's fair, because if it was a private system, you'd have to pay higher insurance premiums and stuff anyway. So it's just the framework.
I mean, a lot of people in our field of work, as you imagine, Jack, ever say, I'm going to go to America because they get paid £200,000 or dollars out of a PhD. And then you say, and you go, yeah, but you have to pay private insurance contributions, you have to pay a higher cost of living, all these things. And, because you live in a completely free market out there, predominantly. The reason we have lower wages in general is because the government takes a bit of our money and does a lot of it for us. And, I'm lazy and that works for me, No, but there's an element of, we do need a system. And the problem is we have politicians who lie to us and sort of tell us that we can have it all, and we can't, unfortunately. And we have to be prepared to pay a little bit more into a system. And I would much rather pay into a system where someone I cared about could get a GP appointment rather than me saving $1,000 a year on tax. I mean, that is way more important to me. So I do think it's a false narrative we've been sold, and I'm glad that we're finally sort of addressing it personally. But yeah. Speaking
of false narratives and lying, shall we move on to the black hole, which is, I think we both agree, been partially manufactured, or at least misrepresented.
So the £22 billion black hole was essentially just a shortfall that was being presented by the Labour government as this £22 billion difference that is the end of the world and all the Tories' fault. It's a little bit of their own construction, right?
Yeah, so bear in mind at the start of the budget, when we were watching it, they did the whole thing about saying that they inherited a mess, blah, blah, blah. And they put a big emphasis on saying that there was this black hole and that the OBR, so that's sort of the independent...
budget responsibility, they're sort of the in-house economists, the idea is, and they forecast and keep a track of the budget.
Yeah, they make sure that we're not doing dodgy, irresponsible things as a government when it comes to the budget, right? And they had said that there was material information, so material being of high importance or significance, material information that had been hidden from the OBR when doing their estimations and forecasts by the Conservative government. Now, bear in mind, when they said this, Jeremy Hunt sat opposite and the camera goes straight to him and he's shaking his head. He looks really, really angry. But they had said that the Tory government had basically been hiding this overspends in certain areas. And the biggest, the most ridiculous one, which isn't the biggest contribution, is asylum and illegal migration payments, which makes up 6.4 billion of that black hole. And can I just read out this bit from BBC News, right? So, over the last 3 years, the department's initial estimated budgets for asylum, border, visa and passport operations amounted to 320 million. But the Institute for Physical Studies said it has ended up spending 7.9 billion and 7.6 billion more than forecast. That is
my God.
just
that is
extreme.
so much money.
So there is a black hole. We can admit that there is definitely something going on there that is wrong and dubious and is a shortfall, 100%. But then a big portion of the black hole is also pay rises that were afforded to the public sector. So that's sort of dubious whether you count that as, is this a liability, financial liability that we should embed in our forecasting of, well, we have to pay these, pay rises, or do we think that these pay rises are above what we were forecasting because you're paying them more? So it's up to you whether you subjectively, I think, on the political spectrum, where you sit as to whether this should be included or excluded as a financial liability that was overlooked. What do you think about it?
Well, I think the whole thing is incredibly childish, just straight out the gate. I mean, I think from both sides, it makes both sides look really, really bad. I mean, I don't.
That's true.
Yeah,
there's no winners, are there?
There's no winners because let's say you're a Conservative voter. Labour looks bad because from their perspective, they either didn't do their due diligence or they're framing this as a political win when it shouldn't be. It should just be get on with the job and shut up. I mean, which is pretty much my opinion. And then from the Conservative side, I mean, obviously it looks bad from the Conservatives because this black hole obviously does exist, but the extent to which seems to be massaged a little bit by Labour. And the whole thing is, to me, it's a few hours out of their day that they could have spent doing something positive and useful. So I'm a little bit annoyed about the whole thing. I try to ignore it. Because I don't think it's worth the airtime that it gets. The only thing that matters is what they do. And it looks like what they've done is pretty positive in terms of raising that revenue and closing that black hole, but they are still spending they're still borrowing an incredible amount of money, aren't they? What are they borrowing? Like 70 billion?
Oh, I don't have that. You did the spending stuff. I can't remember.
Oh, I didn't do the maths.
Sorry, man. I didn't,
no, that's
look
fine.
up the number on the borrowing.
No. I think they're spending about 70 billion in terms of borrowing. And the natural question that arises is, how is this different from a Liz Truss budget in that sense? Because I forget the exact numbers of Liz Truss, but the idea was the same, was we were essentially going to increase the deficit to be able to prompt growth in the economy, which will then end up paying for itself, a very Reagan approach. And it didn't work. The gilt markets essentially collapsed. The Bank of England had to intervene. We will do an episode on this at some point. But essentially, investors who you consider experts in finance and economics to a degree really hated the budget, and it caused all sort of borrowing problems on the market. So the government essentially couldn't borrow at very low interest rates. But you could argue that this is almost symmetrical. This is sort of like the Nigel Farage argument. Well, it's symmetrical if you have large tax cuts and if you have big increases in government spending which aren't financed. So how can you sort of understand why one caused a big problem and one didn't?
That's an argument Nigel Farage sort of implied, at least. It's not one I subscribe to. I think there are substantial and material differences between the two. So to summarise, the similarity that Farage is sort of talking about is that gilt yields, so basically sort of like the cost of borrowing for the government, went up just after the budget and during the budget. Also, the pound dropped after the budget, things like that. Similar stuff to what happened with Liz Truss government, but no one's talking about it because it was substantially less of a problem. They didn't drop by as much, or the cost of borrowing didn't rise as much either. And the difference really is that Liz Truss was borrowing for tax cuts, which there's not much evidence would lead to
very
growth.
little evidence,
and also it doesn't leave you with any assets to show for it. Yeah. Whereas if you invest in stuff, even if it doesn't pay off, you do have invested in some sort of asset, so you get something from it. So it's clearly quite different. Borrowing for assets that provide a return is different to borrowing for tax cuts, which might or might not cause growth in the future.
Well, and that's exactly it as well. As you know exactly where the money is going when you're spending it. You can direct spending to areas that you know need support. Where with tax cuts, you are very much putting the faith in the market, which, let's be honest, has not shown a huge amount of efficiency in the last 14 years. And also, in any economy, there's been very little evidence for tax cuts prompting growth. So, and investors know this.
Long-term growth, yeah.
Long-term growth. And investors know this, and it's pretty well known in the literature. So it's pretty obvious why the difference is been so stark.
Yeah. Yeah, just in case there was someone gritting their teeth being like, it's the same. No, go home.
It's not sharp. Yeah, it's not. Keep your opinions to yourself. Don't start a podcast, mate. Pipe down.
Exactly. So in amongst this, obviously we talked about the tax raise, the spending and things like that. Another thing that they talked about was reform. So they did say across departments there'll be a 2% saving through productivity, efficiency, digitalization, these sort of things. It's another very loose thing, which it's hard to say whether they'll meet that or not.
I just don't buy it. I mean, it's such an outlandish amount of money. If they'd gone, we're going to save 800 million in savings and broadly things are going to work a little bit better, I could go, all right, fine. Yeah.
So it adds on to the sort of idea that they're going to raise loads from frauds, but you got that and the 2% saving across departments. Both of them combined are things that you're not sure they might be able to make. But you can see that sort of comes at the same time as they are investing. A lot of the money that they're spending is in the short term boost, like the first few years, right? And then it slows down. So I think the idea
this is
generous.
Yeah,
the generous idea being that if you spent a lot now to get them back on track, you could maybe get those efficiency savings. You know, if you stop them from crumbling and everyone panicking and running around with like headless chickens, maybe they have time to work out efficiency improvements, and then over time you can start reducing the stimulus to them.
Yeah, that's sort of that's the generous approach.
The generous
that's
view,
the generous approach. You say, well, okay, the reason we're spending a lot up front is because there's these startup costs that we need to overcome and then can taper off afterwards. There's another approach, which is sort of my the cynical approach is that it all just looks political, and you can give a very big number up front and then hide behind the fact that the number's not staying there for very long. It's just staying there for 1 year and then tapering off. I like to subscribe to the first just because I try not to be cynical. I think it's probably, if I'm being realistic, a combination of the two.
Yeah, maybe. That's true. Is there anything more before we can sort of talk about all the stuff that we've successfully predicted or said in previous podcasts?
Yeah, let's just start tooting our own horn. I'm done talking about other people. I'm bored. Now I want to talk about me.
Yeah, so we can say the good things. You've already mentioned HS2 is a plan to go to Euston now, which we said was very important.
HS2, alcohol, smoking, non-dom, minimum wage. What else?
Oh, the only negative thing is the triple lock, isn't it?
Yeah,
Those
I really didn't want to talk. The thing about the triple lock is they are never going to be able to get rid of that, ever, are they?
Yeah.
I mean, it is so politically bulletproof. And especially as the size of the elderly population gets larger. Go back to our pensions episodes, people listening. That is going to become absolutely untouchable in years to come.
But they could have just let it go without tooting their own horn about how the triple lock meant that pensioners were now going to get 4.1% returns, which is over inflation, obviously. So,
of course it is. Because they have to match it to either wages, 2%, or inflation. And inflation's lower, so it must be wages that have increased by 4%.
I imagine it must be.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's ridiculous. I hate it with all my heart. And the only thing is, I mean, politically, the reason they sold it is because they've obviously got so much backlash from this winter fuel allowance that they want to look like they're giving something to pensioners. Yeah, I mean, I think people know how I feel about this. But apart from that, our podcasts have done pretty well at predicting this stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if you had been listening to it, which I doubt anyone other than me did, but if you had been, you would have throughout been like, "Oh, I've heard that on that podcast." Oh,
I know.
Yeah, that's another idea that I'd never have thought of. So that's nice.
So what would you have done differently, Jack? Do you think?
What would I have done differently? So obviously, raising it more through the basic rate of income tax would have been a big part of it. I definitely wouldn't have done the stamp duty thing. I've talked before. I think maybe it might be right to add some sort of higher capital gains to second properties rather than doing like the stamp duty on
council
properties.
tax. Council tax would be another good way of doing this.
Council tax bans should be proportional, right? And they need to be changed because it's ridiculous. I heard on the IFS podcast that somewhere in Blackpool, because of when the properties were valued originally, somewhere in Blackpool will have a much higher council tax than being in a sort of fairly well-off area of London now. You know, like it's so old-fashioned. They need to be changed. Well, we'll get around to that. What else? I mean, it's mostly really quite good, isn't it? I think the I want to say that my favourite part is definitely the change in the debt rules so that we can invest, and it unleashes investment. And I'm glad that we're taxing more to spend on our public services, mostly healthcare, education, dealing with the problems in the justice sector, and obviously defence for.
I was going to say that.
And things like that.
I think defence is a big thing for me as well. I think we didn't really touch on this, but I think we don't really like to talk about foreign policy here. But I think given the current climate, it's really important to start spending on defence. And also, Trump proofs our NATO agreement, which is pretty useful if we're spending over 2.5% or 2% of GDP.
Oh yeah, because he said he wouldn't defend people who didn't meet their requirement, right? So is that what you're saying? Like,
Anyway,
what are your bits?
Well, no. So I'm very much in favour. I would have just had an income tax. I would have. I mean, I think I said to you earlier, the tax system in the UK has just been the accumulation of successive governments just hiding tax increases in the cupboard and in number 10. And then you open that cupboard when you go for a spring cleaning and you go, what the hell's going on here? I mean, it's the equivalent of that when you're cleaning and you just throw everything in a wardrobe or whatever. So I think simplifying the tax system would have been a really important point. I also would have liked to have seen more clarification on, this was brought up quite a lot, more clarity over the exemptions over employer contributions on people like GPs and social carers who are technically public sector but basically run as private sector firms. So I don't exactly know how that would have worked. I would have liked to have seen obviously higher levies on alcohol and tobacco, etc. I would have liked to have seen more stuff to tackle obesity as well. I would have loved to see more stuff on housing. We really didn't see a huge amount on housing, and I think when we do our housing episode, that's going to be really, really important. And I would have liked to have also seen some of the changes to the capital gain rules to account for investments into capital. So I would have liked to have seen tax relief in one form or another for private investment into capital and other projects.
Very good. Yeah.
So, but
did we mention higher education as well?
Oh yes, yeah, no, yeah. We also
that's
didn't
the
see
one
anything
podcast.
About,
it didn't
and also it's the only one that took us 2 episodes. I know it was our first one, but it's one that was so important. I mean, there's a lot going wrong with higher education currently, and it's also one of the only things that really holds up the UK as a powerhouse still. So it needs an urgent bit of TLC, and we didn't.
So it's a shame
get
that and housing didn't get a mention, which is unfortunate, I think.
Truly tragic, but they can only do so much. So if you were to give this budget a rating out of 10, what are you saying?
Out of 10, very good. Out of 10, I would still give it like an 8.
Yeah. I'd give it 8.5, 8.
Like I would say very strong. And bearing in mind,
strong.
I'm very conservative with my ratings for out of 10. You know, I would say 5 is your average. You know, a 5 is an okay.
Yes.
8.
Yeah.
I do think it's a good one. You know, we're sort
good.
of picking at little bits here.
And to be honest, if you're controlling for the fact that they have to get it through politically, maybe it's a 9. I mean, because a lot of these bad decisions are because they have to do it because they've backed themselves into a corner because they're idiots. But if they hadn't backed themselves into a corner, maybe they wouldn't have the constraints in the same way. But given that they have the constraints, I think they've worked within them very, very well.
Yeah. So, on that positive, sunny note...
Yeah, I know, right? Can I have my weekend back now?
Yeah, you can spend some time with the owner, mate, because
I will. Go to fireworks.
You've seen too much of me, I think.
I know. I've got to run to the fireworks now, so hopefully we don't miss them. Otherwise, I'm going to get a bollocking. That's not good.
All right. Well,
anyway,
love to see you again, Charlie.
As always.
See you, mate. Have a good time.
Bye.